Welcome to another School of Poetry for our first ever video special. We'll be chatting remotely about the exciting world of poems, the great and the not so great, as ever. I'm Dr Oli Tearle. I'm a lecturer in English at Loughborough University, and I'm delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues, Dr Barbara Cooke, who's a lecturer in English with a particular interest in 20th century literature, and Dr Kerry Featherstone, who is a lecturer in English and creative writing. Welcome to you both, or welcome back.
Hi.
You're both seasoned veterans and returning guests to the podcast. Although this is the first time that we've had viewers as well as listeners. Obviously, these are unusual times. How have you both been finding working from home and isolation and the lockdown?
Well, I've been enjoying Zooming from different areas of my house. We've been doing quite a lot of video content for our students. So I think one afternoon I went and did that in the garden. And one of my students said it reminded him of how things work on the Tiger King documentary, which I haven't seen, but I'm just going to pretend that I was inspired by that. So I don't know, levels of professionalism kind of go up and down. You know, I've done stuff from my son's bedroom with kind of Lego posters behind me. We're all sort of combining our work with homeschooling as well, like a lot of people are at the moment. So I think there's some really amazing things about it, you know, sort of simplifying life, you know, sort of taking that time just to sort of enjoy the garden and slow down and actually spend time with the family. Of course, that also means you're spending time with the family. So you know, there's other tensions. Yeah. Missing people, I think, is the hardest thing at the moment, right? Missing you guys, missing actually being in a room with you instead of waving at your pixelated faces. And missing students.
My face is pixelated.
Right, no, it's not actually particularly. Well, I suppose technically it is, but it's very smooth, Kerry, very smooth. But I think because it's the last week of term for us at Loughborough, isn't it? And normally we'd be sort of celebrating that with our students.
No, that is one of the real downsides to the whole remote working, that we have, you know, lost that face-to-face interaction with our students. Kerry, how about you? Apart from being smoothly pixelated, how are you doing?
Well, I do try. I'm not lucky enough to have Barbara's hammock experience because my Wi-Fi at home, frankly, doesn't reach the garden. So I'm missing all the sunshine, and I'm basically living in the attic for my working life. This is where I hang out and do my music most of the time. So in between marking dissertations, I've been learning to play the bass guitar.
Yeah. Well, I think you in many ways you're in the perfect location, aren't you, for a poet? The poet in the garret,
Absolutely.
The attic room.
Yeah, this is where I belong.
Yeah, well, I've been in my study here pretty much all day, you know, every day for meetings and for marking and so on. And I've become very, very mindful of what's on my bookshelves. And someone pointed out the other day that I'd color coded my bookshelves like J.K. Rowling and others. And I haven't, no, but I think it's because I think you just see them, some of them there, the Arden Shakespeare. And I did colour code them because I thought I'm not going to spend the time going through them sort of chronologically and arranging them or arranging them by comedy, history, tragedy, and so on. So I thought, I'll colour code them vaguely, but that's all I've done. The rest of them are just thrown onto the bookshelf in any order.
I did up my books. You can see a few just in the background. I have other books. That's not my entire library. But some of them were upside down, and I had to turn them round for this podcast because I can't cope with there being upside down books in the back of the shot. So turns out we're all slightly obsessive about, which is probably a surprise to anybody, but we're given the time and the space to indulge it more, I guess.
Well, I think that's just sensible, isn't it? Wanting the books to be presentable, but we're not taking it to ridiculous lengths. I haven't alphabetized my CDs or anything like that. I'm not that kind of. Well, I don't have, you know.
I was going to say, where are your CDs?
You can see some CDs in the background actually down there, and they're just in any order. So it's all chaos here, really, in terms of my
anarchy.
It's anarchy. I like it that way.
Yeah.
Shall we have a poem? Shall we have a poem read to us, Barbara? You've chosen a poem for us. Would you like to read Milton's sonnet? When I consider how my life is spent.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labour, light denied, I fondly ask? But patience to prevent that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve, who only stand and wait. Do you know, I think this poem has been waiting for me. I learnt it a very long time ago, in my teens, I think. And I sort of learnt it because I needed to recite something. And, you know, I liked it then. And, you know, I sort of knew the sort of formal structure of it. You know, I knew sort of, oh, it's sort of kind of, you know, sort of Renaissance poetry, late Renaissance, you know, the sonnet form, all of that I knew. But in terms of what the sentiment actually is, I think you have to be a bit older to really get it, because when you're young, you don't do much standing and waiting. You know, life can be incredibly busy. You know, you don't necessarily have that longer term perspective on things. But I sort of remembered it in later years. I remember I had a friend who used to move house quite often, and was really used to kind of upping sticks with the whole family. She had 3 little girls and moving around a lot. And there came a time where that wasn't possible for her, and she was really struggling with it. And actually, you know, sort of coming to that piece that she had to, that actually I've got to stay in this place for this time, and that's what I've got to do. So I pulled it out for her then. And I said, actually, sometimes the right thing is just to stand still. And now we are all standing still in a way. You know, there's lots of different kind of activities happening. But the reason I think it's so sort of relevant now is because, particularly at the height of this crisis a few weeks ago, for me, and I guess for others too, it was really hard to know what to do. You know, you want to help, and sometimes that's possible, but for those of us who, for helping usually means getting up and out and active and kind of doing things and seeing people, I think there's something really important in knowing that actually just staying where you are, holding it down, you know, sort of shrinking your life because that's what needs to happen. You are serving. You know, you're serving your community, you're serving the well-being of the country, you know, of the people that you love, just by doing less. And to sort of congratulate yourself for that, I think is really important. And I think there might be a lot of people who need to hear that and remember that at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's it. You know, it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? The idea that that the importance of doing nothing. You know, the importance of know, standing still, as you say, or sitting still, yeah, and just waiting can be of great benefit. You know, and is the right thing to do. And as you say, it's a poem that was written, you know, nearly 400 years ago. And yet still, you know, somehow really resonates with our current situation.
This really resonates for me, actually, because of a silly coincidence. I was actually down in Buckinghamshire on the weekend before the lockdown started, and I drove past signs to Milton's cottage.
And Chalfont St Giles, yeah.
Yeah. So so I pulled up and decided to go for a wander, and it was closed. It said reopens 2 p.m. So I did literally stand and wait. And then it turned out that it wasn't open at all because of the lockdown. So I still haven't been. So I am going to shed some light on that when we're all out of this and I can go back to Chalfont St Giles.
Yes, no, well, I'm from originally from Milton Keynes, and one of the things that often gets repeated about Milton Keynes is, which isn't true at all, that it was named partly after John Milton, which is this kind of rumour that won't die, and I think it's partly because, you know, the Buckinghamshire connection, and obviously it's quite appropriate, I suppose, that it was closed because, of course, he rented that cottage while the plague epidemic was ravaging London, and so he could go and complete Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
And I suppose, I mean, that's the poem that always springs to mind when people hear the name John Milton. If they think of a poem by Milton, it's Paradise Lost, or it's the epic, the big Christian narrative poem. But of course, he obviously wrote it, but he couldn't literally write it. He had to dictate it to secretaries, and this goes back to this poem, doesn't it?
Right.
Because the idea of the light being spent, it's sometimes known by that first line, but it's also commonly known as on his blindness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is something else as well about sort of being kind to yourself and that gap between what you want to do and what you wish you could do, and actually what is possible and what is right. So, and I think for many of our students as well who are struggling, a lot of them are feeling like they're not producing on top form at the moment, and they're feeling very guilty about it. So I think they could learn a little bit from Milton here as well. Say, well, you know, Milton's getting frustrated about the things that he can't do and wants to do, and he's blind. And you have to say, well, you are blind. You know, it's okay not to be able to serve in the ways that a sighted person can, because that is not your situation, and you have to accept your situation for what it is. And so similarly, if you're trying to produce your final coursework in a house full of younger siblings, fighting for bandwidth, fighting for space at the table, you know, having to kind of do conference calls next to your mum who might be talking to her boss and having a very different conversation, that is your situation. And you have to work with that and not blame yourself for the things that are out of your control. So I think because it's Mental Health Awareness Week, isn't it? And I think that is a message for everyone. It's like some things are in your control. There are some ways you can make your situation better, but there are also certain things that won't be ideal, and we just have to accept that and keep remembering that, because I think it was easier to remember that at the beginning of all this when it was all new. So I think we need to keep that sense of compassion for ourselves and for other people, because, the situation still is difficult. And just because it's not new doesn't mean that it's in any way normal.
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose, sorry, Kerry, you were going to come in.
No, I was saying, you know, that patience to prevent that rumour, you know, is having the inner strength to manage to stop that little whisper in you in the back of your mind saying you're not working enough, you're not getting enough done. And Milton has also predicted my situation here in the attic, where for my day labour, I don't actually get any natural light because the Wi-Fi doesn't reach the garden. So there you go. He's a clever man.
He's a clever man. Prescient.
Yeah. Maybe you should rewrite the sonnet, Kerry.
Yeah, well, I should take that as the title, I think. Light Denied.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it's often more difficult for somebody who's had sight, who's been able to go out and do all the sorts of things that Milton had done. He'd been very active. He'd been a prolific writer. I mean, you know, his poetry, he was pretty prolific as a poet. But you know, his prose works, you know, his pamphlets, particularly during the English Civil War.
It's because he's a poet as well.
Exactly, yeah, that's it. All of that writing, and then suddenly he must be wondering, well, how am I going to do that? Will I be able to keep up the same level of productivity? You know, he travelled to Italy in the 1630s. I think he met Galileo, which has always stuck with me, in the 1630s while he was touring Italy. So he'd done all these things. He'd seen more of the world than a lot of people at his time could even dream of seeing. And now he was grappling with the knowledge that, as he says, you know, ere half my days, he's middle-aged, and he's still got things to do, and he feels like he can't do them. But as Barbara says, there are lots and lots of ways of serving, the word that comes back again, again and again in the poem. there are ways of serving which, you know, maybe involve adjusting your expectations and adjusting the way you live your life, but, you know, are still of huge benefit and use to you and to others.
Yeah, and not judging yourself by an inappropriate standard, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what makes the penultimate line quite poignant. You know, the thousands who are, you know, speeding and posting over the land and ocean. You know, the point is not just that Milton can't do that anymore, but that he has previously had that experience and it's been taken away from him.
Yeah.
You know, he hasn't lived his life in this cottage. He's had a wide and very varied life, which kind of makes the loss even worse, doesn't it? Because he's well aware of all the stuff that is out there over land and ocean, and that's what he's lost.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that he, you know, the way he uses the sonnet form, going back to what Barbara said at the beginning, to make that, to make the argument. I mean, a sonnet is often used to kind of express or work through a problem like this, isn't it? You know, it's a poet grappling with one topic and kind of chewing it over, talking it through, working through the internal kind of contradiction in the situation. And he wrote lots of Petrarchan sonnets. He liked the Petrarchan or the Italian sonnet, and he uses that here. And of course, you get that ABBA, ABBA enclosed rhyme in the first 8 lines of the Petrarchan sonnet. And so there's a sense in which I suppose his sense of kind of, you know, inner confinement, if you will, his kind of figurative sense of restriction that he feels through losing his sight is mirrored by the rhymes there. But then when you move out into the last 6 lines and you get, you know, the sestet, it starts to kind of broaden out. The rhymes kind of, you know, move outwards rather than being kind of enclosed and kind of turning back on themselves. Yeah. And so that kind of mirrors quite neatly that
the meter slows down as well, which I really like, particularly the sort of use of his state is kingly, which runs over the end of those 2 lines there. And, you know, his state is kingly. It's kind of almost like someone telling you to go, you know, sort of take a breath.
The same is true of that next line, isn't it? Thousands is bidding speed and post. The enjambment of the and post gives you the sense of all these people rushing around the place.
Yeah,
Also,
absolutely.
like in the final 4 lines, the fact that rhyme scheme is there that Oli's just pointed out means that the rhyme of the A feels slightly delayed in a way that it wouldn't be if you had couplets. So the final rhyme weight is actually delayed, which absolutely makes it appropriate for that final 4 lines.
Exactly, and also the fact that, you know, wait is you know, what linguists would call an intransitive verb. You know, you wait for something, and here we're not told what he's waiting for because it's just enough to wait. Yes. That's the thing. You don't need to have an object in mind.
Yeah. Just... Again, makes it very relevant to our times. There is a lot of waiting going on, but we don't know when we're waiting until or what we're waiting for. We're just waiting. I think that's part of the, you know, what Barbara was saying about, you know, students finding life difficult, is that there isn't a finite point to this. You don't feel as though you're in control because you don't know when it's going to end.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's actually one of the hardest things to deal with. I think, you know, if you have a sort of an end date, you can kind of cross things off in your own way, and you can like, well, I can get through this bit, I can get through this bit.
It's how prisoners get through a prison sentence, isn't it? Is that they know when the end is coming. And I think the psychologically difficult thing about this situation, a couple of my students have said this, when the kind of the second extension of the lockdown was confirmed, that was a real blow because they couldn't knock off the days anymore. It just became indefinite.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I mean, that's the thing. I think going back to Milton saying, you know, ere half my days, he's thinking, you know, this isn't my retirement. This isn't like I can, you know, sit back and feel like I can rest on my laurels and, you know, just as it were, wait for the end, you know, and just live out the rest of my days feeling like I've served, you know, God and myself well. He does feel like, well, you know, I've got all this time stretching ahead of me. what am I going to do? And just that knowledge of just waiting actually kind of provides for him consolation. But obviously for us, there is a sense of well, not having an end point is part of the difficulty.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think just a final point on form. There's a really neat use of the sonnet's traditional kind of change in focus going on.
Yes.
It's sort of very neatly cut there. So you have Milton being anxious in his own mind through the beginning octave, and then you actually get but. So it's actually very clearly announced, and it's almost like he's essentially introducing a second voice into this poem. It is a conversation with himself. Patience is actually the one speaking, so it's almost like sort of intervention of a kind of saintly character, or that sort of personification of patience. I find really interesting there as well. And
also it comes slightly earlier than you'd expect from
it does half a line
not
earlier,
the beginning of the ninth line, but mid-line. Again, going back to what you're saying about the run-on line, his state is kingly. You get but patience to prevent preventing, and then it gets into it. But it comes a little bit earlier. He's already, as it were.
So it feels like an interruption. It feels like someone who's running on and so go, oh my god, and then someone says, hang on.
Yeah.
Sort of making that. It's a very kind of interventionist use of language there in that line.
And patience, of course, a Christian virtue, so they're kind of capitalized, personified.
Yeah, personified. Absolutely. Patience is kind of playing an active role here. Patience is an agent in this.
Yeah, an emissary of God, I would say. Sort of doing God's work.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind etymologically that patience, is related to suffering. It comes from the word. The idea is you have to suffer to, endure something. So there is this sense of he knows it's difficult, and patience, as an idea, is about acknowledging it's not going to be easy, but it's about accepting that and realizing the worth in it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, no, thank you very much, Barbara, for choosing that poem. As you say, it speaks to our own time in all sorts of
certainly does,
ways. I think it's like a lot of great poetry. It takes something that seems very, very bleak and hopeless as a starting point. This idea he's losing his sight and he doesn't know what he's going to do as a man still in his prime, but actually finds this way forward. So I think it's a very kind of affirmative poem.
And prosperity bears it out, right? So, we remember Milton, we remember him as a great man. So he needn't have worried.
We remember him for a poem that he hadn't completed yet.
Exactly.
He would only complete Paradise Lost when he'd, in his later years.
So it's like, just hang on, Milton. Your time is coming, and you'll know it when it does.
Right, well, now we're going to turn from the 17th century and the world of John Milton to some poetry that's altogether more recent in our contemporary poetry spotlight. And Kerry, I think you've got a contemporary poem that you'd like to tell us about.
Yeah, it's probably pinching it a bit to call this contemporary because it actually dates back to 1979.
Ollie and I weren't born then, just so you know.
But I was. Thanks for that, Barbara.
Sorry.
Well, was it W.B. Yeats that said even an old man has the right to call his contemporaries modern?
Yes.
So there you go. If it's okay for Yeats, it's okay for me. So this is The Visitor from Carolyn Forché's collection called The Country Between Us, which I think came out in 1979. I'll read it, shall I? And then we'll discuss. So this is The Visitor. In Spanish, he whispers, "There is no time left." It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador. The wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country. There is nothing one man will not do to another.
Thank you, Kerry. So yeah, what made you choose that poem for today?
I think this is one of the first poems that I read kind of outside of an educational setting and was just blown away by. For me, it's I mean, I think the images are very strong, the idea of being in prison. So we've got this kind of prison scene. But for me, it was the use of the sounds of the words. There's no formal rhyme scheme here, but the use of alliteration and resonance and all those kinds of techniques is so powerful. I think the line about the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador, as I think probably in the whole of my career writing poetry, I've been trying to live up to those two lines. I think those are so good that I think that set the standard for me.
Yeah.
I was completely blown away by this whole collection when I read it, and actually the anecdote about finding this collection is that I stole it by accident. I found this in a bookshop. I was a teenager. I found it in a bookshop. I started reading it, and I was so engrossed by it that I literally walked out of the shop still reading it and forgot to pay. And it wasn't until I was on the train going home that I realized that I owed the bookshop owner £1.75. So, you know, that was the immediate impact that it had on me, is that I was completely lost. I was completely in a different space just reading these poems for the first time.
So see, when you put it that way.
Sorry, I was engrossed by poetry.
Yeah. I wonder if anyone that defence has ever worked in court.
I don't imagine so. No.
But the thing is, when you put it that way, you know, I can imagine if you wrote to Forché and, you know, Forché learned that her poetry had that kind of effect on you, then, you know, that's kind of the ultimate accolade for, you know, that a poet would have that kind of impact on the reader. But then at the same time,
yeah.
I don't get any royalties from that.
No, I didn't know this at the time, but she's now a professor of poetics at Georgetown University, and I went to do a conference at Georgetown a few years ago, and I didn't actually know that Forché was a professor at Georgetown. I might have been tempted to drop her an email and explain.
Oh, yeah.
But, anyway, I mean, I think the poem is just beautiful. I think this idea of the guys inside the prison, and his wife's hand and his wife's breath. You know, he desperately wants to be with her, and he's touching the walls as he walks around the walls. And she relates so cleverly what his voice sounds like in the prison to the sounds of the wheat and the farmers' work in the outside, in the big sort of horizons of Salvador in the farmland. So it's a very clever link.
Yeah, there's also this sort of hissing sound, isn't there, that your hand would make as you drag it along a wall, would sound like a kind of whisper, and would sound like the whisper of the wind. I really like that use of imagines his hand to be hers. You'd imagine that to be he imagines his hand in hers or something like that, but no, she actually elides the difference between the two, which I think is really nice, subtle kind of turning.
And even the kind of the sort of longing in that aspirant, the H, the his hand to be hers. That's it's so many, as you say, so many subtle kind of sound effects, linguistic effects going on that tell the story, convey the situation beyond the kind of merely functional level of, you know, this is the situation. It's a really good example of how poetic the meaning of the poem is bound up with how the poet puts things across, the effects.
Absolutely,
there might be actually kind of, in a way, seemingly separate from what the poem is actually saying. It's a bit like that thing where a poem sometimes is written in a particular meter, but the meter that seems at odds with the meaning of what the words are actually saying. But here, it's like the sound effects themselves tell a story all by themselves, don't they?
I think one of the things that I'm most interested in and most enjoy about poetry, both as a reader and a writer, is that relationship between sound and meaning. I don't think, when I first read this poem, I don't think I had done enough thinking or writing to be able to kind of articulate that to myself. I think it was just instinctive, that's what I was responding to. With hindsight, I think that's what it was about the poem that really attracted me.
Yeah.
I think, you know, it's also an example of how much you can do in a short space. This is only 9 lines, and it really contains a huge amount. And there are some interesting parallels here. The ending when you're talking about the Milton poem, and you've got that but that comes in halfway along a line, and here the penultimate line, the full stop falls halfway along the line, and then we've just got the sentence, "It is a small country." It's the end of that penultimate line. And of course, that could refer to Salvador as a whole, which is a relatively small country, but also the fact that in that prison cell, he has a small country kind of imagined, and the sounds and all that kind of, there's an interior small country as well as an exterior one.
It's almost kind of physical, it's almost John Donne.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I almost suggested John Donne actually for today. And yeah, he does actually quite a similar thing to, you know, in sort of imagining the world within a confined space. So in Donne, you've got the poem about the four-poster bed, haven't you? And he and his lover kind of create an entire continent inside that very small environment. So yeah, I did think about that one for today as well. I think Forché is just so adept at like sort of brevity and conciseness. I love this collection too, Kerry. I think I first came to it as an undergraduate. And you know, there's the kernel in there, which is sort of hovering on that brink between poetry and prose. And it's just a perfect little incident that, and every single word in that story, which is about Forché going to visit as a sort of a colonel in one of the kind of militia that are fighting at the time, and he does a single act which speaks to the utter brutality of the situation. But you know, there's talk about kind of glass on the outside of the walls, and the sort of inanimate world is very alive in Forché. It seems to be bearing witness all the way through, and to be an active part of what's going on, and you get that here as well, don't you, in The Visitor?
Yeah, I think you're right. The Colonel is another good example of that.
Yeah.
I did a masterclass on the prose poem with a poet called Roger Robinson, who's a fantastic poet and performer of poetry. And his, to my delight, the first example that he showed us in his masterclass on prose poetry was The Colonel by Carolyn Forché. So it obviously is it's a collection that's had an impact on a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
Seek it out, folks. The Country Between Us by Carolyn Forché.
There we are. Yeah, a poet who should be better known.
Absolutely.
Great recommendation. Thank you, Kerry.
No problem.
And now we turn to a section of the podcast which we like to call So Bad It's Good, where we share poems that are so bad that they're really actually quite enjoyable, but for all the wrong reasons, probably.
I think this is what most people look forward to, you know, much more than our discussion of poems, but they really want to hear the bad stuff, don't they?
Yeah, this is the highlight for them. And I've got
poised between pleasure and pain. So I like
I think that sums up the experience of this segment so well. I've actually got here the in many ways the kind of golden treasury of bad verse in English, that the Stuffed Owl, which came out in 1930, I think, and you know, spans the centuries, go through all the anthologies and poetry collections of ages past that have been forgotten in the main. But
that's
there
an
are
interesting date there, Oli. 1930.
1930, yeah. Well,
I'm just thinking there's been so much bad poetry since 1930. I mean,
this needs updating. It really does. I think there needs to be Stuffed Owl 2, and possibly 3 and 4 as well, and so on. I mean, yeah, this only really goes up to the, as you'd expect, the turn of the century, really. And the poem I've chosen for today is actually from the mid 19th century. So we're going back to the time of the Victorians, and a poet who was born in the 1830s in England, in Gloucestershire, a poet called Adam Lindsay Gordon. But he actually made his name as a poet the other side of the world, in Australia, where he emigrated in the 1850s when he was a young man. And he went to kind of, seek his fortune and make a name for himself. And he had a bit of a checkered career in all sorts of different areas. He was, as well as a poet, he was a politician. He was a policeman for a while. He was also a jockey. You think policeman and jockey? Normally police officers then used to be quite tall. Jockeys quite small. So
probably had a really big horse.
Maybe that was his secret, and I don't know how successful he was as a jockey either. Whether that was a a very short-lived career. It's well worth Googling a picture of Adam Lindsay Gordon, though. Look him up on Google Images, because there are some great portraits of him, including my favourite, which is a black and white photograph of him standing up. And he's got his hand on one hip, and he's leaning on a chair with the other hand. But he's just got the oddest appearance. You know, he's one of those people who you think once seen, never forgotten. And certainly
does it apply to his poetry as well?
It certainly does, yeah. Well, it's interesting about his poetry, because he really kind of embodies "So Bad It's Good" for us, because his contemporary, a writer called Marcus Clarke, who was also writing in Australia at the time, he described Gordon's work as the beginnings of a national school of Australian poetry, which may suggest that it's really, you know, resonant and technically accomplished and influential, but certainly it wasn't of uniform quality, I don't think. And I'm just going to read a very short excerpt here, a poem that's been called "The Fight in the Cave." A lot of his poems are about the outdoors, as you might imagine from an Australian poet writing in the 19th century, sort of exploring the vast terrain of the country. And "The Fight in the Cave" is just 8 lines. I'm just going to read here. But these are probably my favourite of all I've read of Gordon's. Flash, flash, bang, bang, and we blazed away, and the grey roof reddened and rang. Flash, flash, and I felt his bullet flay the tip of my ear. Flash, bang, bang, flash, and my pistol arm fell broke. I struck with my left hand then, struck at a corpse through a cloud of smoke. I had shot him dead in his den. So it's this rather kind of triumphant account of a kind of standoff, and but just the repeated flashes and bangs is just, they're just very ill-judged, and it's kind of halfway between a poem that I read out in this segment on a previous show, which is Theo Marzial's "A Tragedy," which has all those plops in it. You know, plop, you know, this kind of weird poem. It's kind of halfway between that and something like Baldrick's poem about the German guns.
I was just going to say, the guns go boom, boom, boom.
And you know, and about combat, you know, and but it's, yeah, it just, all the exclamation marks and the onomatopoeia in the right place in a poem judged well can produce wonderful effects. But here,
I shot him in his den. I like that kind of very conclusive summing up in case you couldn't follow the action as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With a very triumphant final exclamation mark as well. Just say, "Oh yeah,
well done,
you."
I also like the fact that he inverts bang flash to flash bang.
Yeah.
Quite late in the poem, almost as if he's only just worked out how a gun works. It's actually the flash comes first, doesn't it?
It's almost, but there's kind of images pairs, like you say, in the right way. Onomatopoeia can be quite nice, because there's Amy Lowell who uses it quite a lot, you know, because there's her one of her starts sort of bump tong pang delirium flapping its thigh bones, I think, which which I think was ridiculed at the time, but is also brilliant. I mean, the difference between "I had shot him in his den" and "delirium flapping its thigh bones" is quite marked.
Yeah. There's a whole new level of poetic ingenuity, I think, in Lowell than you find in this. But
there you are, you see, there's something quite futurist about it as well, isn't it? The glorification of war, and you know.
That's very true. Maybe he was ahead of his time in some ways, and certainly, you know, he's saying what he sees. You know, you can't accuse him of kind of describing what's going on very directly.
I love the kind of the fake heroics of being shot at, and it turns out that it's hit the tip of his ear.
Yeah.
It's not the most heroic of wounds, is it? It's not like a saber slash, you know, Austerlitz.
And clearly the appropriate response is to shoot someone dead if they clip your ear with a bullet.
Yeah.
Flashback.
So yeah, I mean, in many ways it is memorable. I mean, you know, flashbang. I'll be hearing flashes and bangs for the rest of the day now, thanks to Gordon. Kerry, do you have an embarrassingly bad?
Well, this is an interesting one. We're going in a completely different direction here because I've been reading about artificial intelligence and poetry. So this raises an interesting question. Can it be embarrassingly bad if it was written by a machine? Should the machine be embarrassed? And can the machine be told that it should feel embarrassed?
Can machines feel shame?
I don't know.
It feels like a Philip K. Dick story that's, yet to be discovered among his papers.
Or can we feel ashamed for them?
Yeah, I think, we will see.
Well,
do you have some excerpts for us?
I have a poem for you. Quite a few teams interested in AI have kind of been exploring whether machines can write poetry. This one comes from a Microsoft team at Kyoto University. This is a couple of years ago. There are some actually that are equally worth checking out, where the machine was fed several hundred unpublished romance novels as its database and told to write poetry from that.
I love it already. That's already brilliant.
Delight. This one is a bit shorter and less complex. Okay, so this is written by a computer at Kyoto University.
Right.
Yeah, there is arguably a sort of poetic turn halfway through. This realm of rain, grey sky and cloud, it's quiet and peaceful, safe, allowed, and arguably worse. I am a coal truck. By a broken heart, I have no sound. The sound of my heart, I am not.
Oh, that's great.
Actually, that last line is,
existential. I am not.
I am a coal truck.
Yeah.
Coal truck. I mean, that the metaphor. I mean, we're all carbon, aren't we? We're a carbon. So maybe I feel like I should have a pipe to smoke here in my study. Maybe there's some truth.
I think you had Pursued's corner in this discussion. We're made of carbon, therefore we are coal trucks, metaphorically.
We are trucks. We are traveling around in our lives.
Came from a sort of the romance. It was fed unpublished romance poems.
No, this is a different experiment. No, this is a different.
I was going to say, because I'm not sure who's writing romance about coal trucks, but I want to read it for sure.
No, this is a different experiment. I don't know where the coal truck thing. I mean, if you were fed a lexicon of English vocabulary, it would be a 1 in a million that the computer would pick on the image of a coal truck to represent a broken heart.
Depends what years you're talking about. I mean, if it was fed stuff from the 1940s and 50s, then which is a kind of problem with some of this AI stuff, isn't it? That you get out what you put in. So if you're putting in, sort of language, sort of gathered earlier on or from a particular group of people, then the results are going to reflect that. And it's one of the problems we have going forward with the stuff, that you need a hell of a lot of language to feed into something so it can produce stuff randomly. But the biggest amounts of language we have are already kind of out of date. So, it's a bit of a tricky thing when you're trying to get AI to write things.
And I think one of the things about this is that the computer was trained to recognize patterns of language and repetition and to associate certain colors and objects with emotions. Now, obviously, that training is human-led. So at some point, there may have been a computer programmer who did associate a coal truck with a broken heart and fed it into the computer. And that's why the computer thinks it's done the right thing here. So there is a kind of human impact going on behind there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think the other thing about sort of AI and creative writing is that it can kind of privilege a very sort of objective kind of fly on the wall style, which it can sound absolutely great, and then sometimes has that slightly off kilter where you know that it's not quite humanly done. There's an experiment where they rewrote Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Don't know if you heard about that. Yeah, so it was the car was sponsored by Google, I think, that was driven around America, and it had a camera in it, and then the data that was sort of being gathered from the camera was then described supposedly objectively, like so it was just saying what it saw. But you know, in sort of, and it came up with some very, very odd combinations of things, which did sound poetic, but were kind of nonsense at the same time. So
I mean, this is an interesting. I mean, yeah. I mean, Kerry, you write your own poems. I mean, sometimes do you feel like? I mean, a lot of poets say this, that they're not sure where a line comes from. It just sort of, you know, pops unbidden into your head, and you think, well, that's a great image for that. That's a great. But you know, it's unconscious, or maybe it's something you read recently, but you'd half forgotten, and you rework it into your own phrase. Or
there are quite a few occasions where I've actually Googled phrases because I was sure that it wasn't me who'd thought of it.
Yeah.
But I think you also, as a writer, you're trying to spot your own cold truck moments, aren't you? You're trying to filter out all that stuff where it was going well, and then suddenly you put a great big cold truck in there, and you didn't notice because it sounded natural to you. I think the Caroline thing is interesting because you know, one of the famous criticisms of On the Road is that's not writing, that's typing.
Yeah.
And you know, that AI experiment is literally, you know, turning On the Road into some automatic typing.
Yeah, I think, but I would just say again that it's always the case that the computer does what you teach it to do. Yep. So, you know, the sorts of things that were being outputted did originate from a human brain at some point. Yeah. So rather than it being like totally artificial, I guess it's more of a kind of strange mulching down of lots of different people's views and patterns and ways of seeing the world. And it's quite interesting to see where they don't quite join up.
I think I might sort of incorporate this in my teaching. I think we should have a workshop called Spot the Coal Truck. You know, people do feedback on each other's poems and try to identify if there are any incidental coal trucks.
Okay. Yeah, I'm up for that. Good. Yeah. Any kind of linguistic vehicles, but in a very literal sense. Not.
Yeah. And can you spot the poem that was written by AI among a load of poems that were written?
This is one of the discussions. Yeah. And for me, one of the interesting questions is, could a machine tell the difference? I think that's a really telling, you know, because a human probably can tell the difference more easily than a machine, because the machine thinks it's doing what the humans are doing.
Yeah.
We think that's what the machine thinks. I mean, we don't really know, do we? That's one of the beauties of it. Something goes in, something comes out, and we don't quite know what happens in between.
Well, it could be that the servers, after everybody's gone home, are nudging each other and going, I put a coal truck in there and they didn't notice.
Incidentally, I think The Coal Truck would be a good title for an anthology of AI created poems. It should definitely get that commissioned by someone. Right, well, that's almost it for another podcast. But before we go, we'd like to leave you with a couple of suggestions for uplifting poems to seek out in these rather unusual and uncertain times. So, Barbara, you've got an uplifting poem you'd like to recommend to our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I think it's something about getting on board with the homeschooling and hearing a lot more about my son's school experiences. So it's got me thinking about school in general, and memories of my own schooling too. So I've been thinking a lot about the Alan Alberg collections that he wrote about school life. So the most famous was Please Mrs. Butler. And I've noticed that Oti Mabuse, the absolutely wonderful dancer from Strictly Come Dancing, is reading Please Mrs. Butler on BBC Bite Size at the moment. So if you want to go and listen to her, please do, especially if you've got small people at home. But he wrote quite a few of these collections, and we were talking before this recording, and I think quite a few of us remember them. And they show their age in some ways. It's kind of quite quaint. They talk about teachers smoking in the staff room and stuff like that, which of course never ever happen now. But there's one in particular that I wanted to read, with the suggestion that you go away and dig out all these school poem collections again, either for you or for the kids if they're around. But the one I wanted to read is one that seems particularly relevant again, and it's called Things I Have Been Doing Lately.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Mine's a slight change of direction. My recommendation is a Stevie Smith poem, wonderful 20th century poet. And she wrote a wonderful poem called The Galloping Cat. which is told from the perspective of a cat. Regular listeners of the podcast will know I love a good cat poem, and particularly poems that really capture the eccentric wildness of the felines. This poem is just great fun. It's written in this kind of really wild, exuberant, sort of free verse. And the cat goes off, slips on a banana skin that someone's left, gets stroked bald by people stroking him, and just carries on across the landscape. So it's just a nice, fun poem about a cat that always raises a smile when I think about it. We hope you seek out those suggestions and enjoy them. And many thanks for listening to and indeed watching this podcast today. And many thanks to my two guests, Barbara Cooke and Kerry Featherstone. Thank you very much for joining me for another show.
Thank you, Oli.
You're welcome to the coal truck.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. We need to get the coal truck out there.
That's why I don't have lifting poems. I'm a coal truck.
Yeah. What more do we need? Yeah.
Weighed down by the oar of centuries. Oh, stop.
Oh, yeah. We could go on about that one phrase, but we won't. We will bid you farewell for now, and until next time, take care, stay well, and stay well versed.